The silence of the South Australian Outback stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the whisper of red dust dancing across the cracked earth and the occasional bleat of sheep huddled beneath the sparse shade of a ghost gum. Here, where the world seemed to forget itself, time moved differently, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the slow arc of shadows and the patient rhythm of survival. Amelie Fairweather stood on the weathered veranda of a modest homestead, her weathered hands gripping a cup of tea gone cold. At 52, she had the kind of face that spoke of stories untold, lines etched not by age alone, but by the quiet accumulation of loss, resilience, and a particular solitude that comes from choosing to remain where others flee. Her grey hair, pinned back with the precision of her former nursing days, caught the afternoon light as she surveyed her small flock of sheep scattered across the parched paddock. 3 years had passed since Robert's funeral. 3 years since the last human voice had shared her supper table or wished her good night. The neighbors, such as they were in this vast emptiness, lived too far away to be anything more than distant smoke signals on washing day. She had grown accustomed to the silence, even found comfort in it. Here, there were no pitying glances, no well-meaning advice about what a woman of her age should or shouldn't do. Here, there was only the honest work of keeping things alive in a land that seemed determined to let everything die. The sheep were restless today, she noticed. Their usual placid grazing had given way to nervous clustering, heads lifted frequently to test the air. Even the ever-present flies seemed subdued, their buzzing muted by something heavier than heat. Amelie's practice, I swept the horizon, noting the unusual stillness of the air and the way the eucalyptus leaves hung motionless, as if the very landscape was holding its breath. In the distance, where the red earth met the pale sky, a darkness was gathering, not the comfortable darkness of evening. Still hours away, but something more ominous, a wall of cloud that seemed to swallow the light as it approached. A storm was coming, and by the look of it, a fierce one. She would need to secure the chickens, check the water tanks, and bring the sheep closer to shelter. In this country, preparation wasn't just prudence. It was survival. She was turning to fetch her work gloves when movement on the far edge of a property caught her eye. A figure emerged from the shimmering heat haze, walking with the measured gait of someone who had traveled far and still had farther to go. A man, she could see now, leading what appeared to be a horse, though the distance and the dancing air made details impossible to discern. Visitors were rare in this corner of the world, and unexpected ones even rarer. Amelie's hand instinctively moved to the rifle that hung by the door, not from fear, but from the caution that came with living alone in a place where help was measured in days, not minutes. She had learned long ago that in the outback, strangers could mean salvation or trouble, and it was wise to be prepared for either. As the figure drew closer, she could make out more details. A tall man, broad-shouldered beneath a worn coat, his hat pulled low against the sun. His pace was steady but unhurried, the walk of someone accustomed to long distances and uncertain welcomes. There was something in his bearing that spoke of purpose, yet also of wariness, the kind of careful alertness she had seen in men who had learned that the world could turn dangerous without warning. When he was close enough that she could see his face, weathered, with a kind of tan that spoke of years under harsh suns, and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing, he raised one hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or surrender. His other hand held the reins of a bay gelding that looked as travel-worn as its master. "Afternoon," he called, his voice carrying the trace of an accent she couldn't immediately place. "I wonder if I might trouble you for some water? For the horse, if not for me." There was courtesy in his words, but also something else, a formality that seemed to keep the world at a careful distance. Amelie remained on a veranda, one hand still near the rifle, studying this unexpected visitor. He was older than she had first thought, probably near her own age, with gray threading through hair that had once been dark. His clothes were clean but worn, the garments of a man who took care of what he had because he couldn't easily replace it. "Water's free," she replied, her voice carrying its own careful neutrality. "Tank's by the barn. Help yourself." He nodded his thanks and moved toward the water tank, his horse following with the patient resignation of an animal accustomed to uncertainty. Amelie watched as he filled his water bottles first, then led the horse to drink. Good sense. She noted, the kind that came from experience with harsh country. When the horse had drunk its fill, the man filled his own cupped hands and drank deeply, water running down his stubbled chin and darkening his shirt front. It was as he straightened, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, that the wind chose that moment to gust with sudden violence, sending his hat tumbling across the yard and revealing hair that was indeed more silver than brown. In the same instant, something, a piece of metal on his belt, perhaps, or a button on his coat, caught the late afternoon sun and sent a brilliant flash directly into Amelie's eyes. Startled, her vision momentarily blinded by the unexpected glare, Amelie's hand found the rifle and brought it up in an instinctive movement born of years of solitary vigilance. The flash had seemed to come from where the man stood, and in a sun-dazzled confusion, training and instinct took over. She fired. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed across the silence, causing the sheep to scatter in bleeding panic, and sending a flock of cockatoos shrieking from a nearby tree. The man spun around, his hand flying to his shoulder, his face registering shock and pain in equal measure. Bloody hell! The exclamation burst from him, his careful courtesy abandoned as he staggered backward, his free hand coming away from his shoulder dark with blood. What in God's name? Oh! The word escaped Amelie in a rush of horrified realization. Her hands, still gripping the rifle, began to shake as the sun blindness cleared, and she could see what she had done. Oh, dear Lord, the sun caught something, and I couldn't see, and I thought. The man was leaning against his horse now, his face pale beneath the weather tan, his injured arm hanging at an awkward angle. Blood was seeping between the fingers of the hand pressed against his shoulder, darkening the faded blue of his shirt. His eyes, when they met hers across the yard, held pain and confusion, but surprisingly, no anger. You thought I was what exactly? His voice was strained but still oddly gentle, as if he were more curious and accusatory about finding himself shot by a woman he had never met. Amelie set the rifle carefully aside and hurried down from a veranda, her nursing instincts overriding her caution. I don't know what I thought, she admitted as she approached him. The light flashed, and for a moment I couldn't see anything, and living alone, you learn to. She stopped, studying his pale face and the way he was swaying on his feet. We need to get you inside. That needs attention. I'm fine, he said automatically, then winced as a movement of speaking jarred his wounded shoulder. It's just His words were cut short as his knees buckled. Amelie moved quickly, catching his good arm and helping to steady him as the world seemed to tilt around him. The blood loss, the shock, and perhaps the long travel that had brought him here were taking their toll. No, you're not fine, she said firmly, slipping her arm around his waist to support his weight. And arguing with a woman who just shot you seemed particularly poor judgment, don't you think? Despite the pain and the blood and the strangeness of the situation, the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Fair point, he managed, leaning heavily on her slight frame as she guided him toward the house. As they made their slow progress across the yard, the wind gusted again, stronger this time, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon was moving faster than Amelie had anticipated, and the sky above them was darkening with unnatural speed. Whatever else this day was to bring, it seemed it would bring weather to match its strangeness. The first fat raindrop began to fall as they reached the veranda, spattering against the worn boards and sending up tiny puffs of dust. Behind them, the horse whinnied nervously, sensing the approaching storm. The sheep had given up their scattered panic and were now huddled together near the barn, their natural instincts guiding them toward whatever shelter they could find. Your horse, the man mumbled, his weight growing heavier against her as they climbed the steps. Will survive better than you will if we don't get this bleeding stopped, Amelie replied briskly, pushing open the door to her kitchen. The barn's open. He'll figure it out. As if summoned by her words, the bay gelding trotted toward the barn, seeking shelter from the first scattered drops of what promised to be a significant storm. The animal, like its master, seemed to possess the kind of practical intelligence that came from long experience with uncertainty. Inside the modest kitchen, Amelie guided her unexpected patient to a chair beside the scrubbed wooden table. The room was simple but clean, furnished with the basic necessities of a woman who had learned to make do with little but insisted that little be done well. A black iron stove dominated one corner, its surface clean and ready. Shelves lined the walls, holding mismatched crockery and the preserved fruits and vegetables that would see her through the seasons when the garden lay fallow. "Sit," she commanded, already moving toward the cupboard where she kept her medical supplies. Old habits died hard, and despite the years since she had last practiced a profession, she had maintained a well-stocked medicine chest. In this country, injuries were common and doctors scarce. The man, she realized he didn't even know his name, lowered himself carefully into the chair, his movement speaking of pain kept carefully controlled. His face had gone gray beneath the tan, and fine beads of sweat stood out on his forehead despite the coolness of the approaching storm. "What's your name?" she asked as she set her supplies on the table beside him. Clean clothes, antiseptic, needle, and thread. The familiar tools of mending what was broken. "Josh," he replied, his voice tight with pain. "Josh van der Meer." The accent she had noticed became more pronounced as he spoke his surname, revealing origins far from this red earth. "Dutch?" she asked, beginning to carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt to reveal the wound beneath. "By birth," he confirmed, then winced as the cloth pulled away from the injury. "Haven't seen Holland in more years than I care to count." The bullet had passed through the flesh of his shoulder, missing bone and major blood vessels by what she could see was mere luck. It was a clean wound, though painful and bloody, and would heal well with proper care. As her fingers probed gently around the injury, she found herself noting the scars that mark his arms and chest, old wounds, some clearly from bullets, others from blades. This was not a man who had lived a peaceful life. "You've been hurt before," she observed, beginning to clean the wound with steady, practiced movements. "Once or twice," he admitted, his breathing controlled despite what she knew must be considerable pain. "Though I'll admit this is the first time I've been shot by a woman offering me water." Despite herself, despite the gravity of the situation and the blood on her hands and the storm building outside, Amelie felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. "First time I shot a man asking for it, so I suppose we are even in terms of new experiences." Outside, the wind was growing stronger, rattling the windows and sending debris skittering across the yard. The first experimental drops of rain had given way to a steady patter that promised much more to come. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the long roll of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small house. As Amelie worked, cleaning and dressing the wound with the competence of long practice, she became aware of the strange intimacy of the moment. Here was a man whose name she had learned only minutes ago, whose presence on her property had been as unexpected as a storm now breaking overhead, and yet she was tending to his body with a kind of attention usually reserved for family or loved ones. Her hands moved gently but surely, and she found herself noticing things beyond the medical necessities. The way his jaw tightened against the pain without complaint, the careful way he held himself still to make her work easier, the fact that despite the circumstances, he seemed more concerned about the inconvenience to her than the injury to himself. "There," she said finally, securing the bandage with practiced efficiency. "The bullet went clean through, which is fortunate. You'll be sore for a while, and you'll need to keep it clean and dry, but barring infection, it should heal well enough." Josh flexed his fingers experimentally, testing the mobility of his arm. "Thank you," he said simply, and there was something in his voice that suggested the gratitude extended beyond the immediate medical attention. "I don't suppose I could trouble you for the use of your barn tonight? The storm looks to be settling in, and travel seems inadvisable." As if to underscore his words, the wind chose that moment to howl around the house with renewed fury, driving rain against the windows with enough force to make the glass vibrate in its frames. The storm had arrived in earnest, and even from the relative safety of the kitchen, they could hear the violence of it building outside. Amelie moved to the window, peering out through the rain-streaked glass at a world transformed. The gentle afternoon light had given way to an ominous gray-green darkness, and the wind was bending the trees with a force that spoke of serious weather. Her sheep were nowhere to be seen, hopefully having found shelter in the lee of the barn or the rocky outcrop beyond the paddock. The horse, Josh's horse, was visible as a dark shape pressed against the barn wall, head lowered against the driving rain. Josh looked surprised, perhaps by the offer itself or by the matter-of-fact way it was delivered. That's kind of you, especially considering I'm bleeding on your furniture because you shot me. Yes, well, Amelie replied dryly, beginning to clear away the medical supplies. It seems the least I can do under the circumstances. Though I should warn you, the bed hasn't been slept in since my husband died 3 years ago, so the sheets might be a bit musty. There was a moment of silence between them, filled by the sounds of the storm raging outside. In that pause, both seemed to become aware of the strange turn their day had taken, of how quickly they had moved from strangers to something more complicated. Not quite friends, certainly not enemies, but two people bound together by circumstance and the approaching fury of the weather. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, illuminating the kitchen in stark white relief before plunging it back into the gray gloom of the storm. Thunder followed almost immediately, a crack so loud it seemed to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Whatever this storm was, it was going to be fierce, and it was going to last. If stories of grit, compassion, and unlikely bonds in the middle of nowhere move your heart, subscribe to our channel and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to know where the Outback finds its echo. Chapter 1. The Bullet and the Boundary. The spare bedroom held the particular stillness of a space kept ready but unused, where dust motes danced and whatever light managed to penetrate the storm-darkened windows. Amelie stripped the old sheets from the narrow bed with brisk efficiency, her movement speaking of a woman accustomed to making do and making things right. The room itself was spartanly furnished, a single bed, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a wooden chair that had seen better decades. But it was clean and dry, which under the circumstances seemed like considerable luxury. Just stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame for support, watching her work with an expression that might have been bemusement. His color had improved somewhat since he had bandaged his shoulder, though he still moved with the careful precision of someone managing pain. "You don't have to fuss," he said as he shook out fresh linens with a kind of sharp snaps that spoke of long practice. "I've slept rough plenty of times. A roof and 4 walls are more comfort than I had expected when I woke up this morning." "I'm not fussing," Amelie replied, tucking the corners of the sheets with military precision. "I'm simply making sure my patient doesn't develop an infection from sleeping in dirty bedding. It would reflect poorly on my nursing skills." "Ow, so you were a nurse," Josh observed, settling more heavily against the doorframe as a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the house. "I wondered where you learned to clean a gunshot wound with such confidence." She paused in her bed making, her hands stilling on the quilt she was smoothing into place. "Bush nurse, years ago, before I married Robert." Her voice carried a matter-of-fact tone that didn't quite mask the weight of memory. "You learn to treat everything from snake bites to childbirth complications when the nearest doctor is a day's ride away. Must have been useful skills in a place like this," he said, then added with a dry humor that surprised them both. "Though I imagine most of your patients weren't shot by their hosts upon arrival." Despite herself, Amelie felt a laugh escape her, the first genuine laughter these walls had heard in longer than she cared to remember. "No, that would be a first. Though I did once have a man come to me with a bullet wound he claimed came from a particularly vindictive emu." "Did you believe him?" "Not for a moment. Emus don't typically carry rifles. But he was bleeding, so the story mattered less than the wound." She finished with the bedding and stepped back to survey her work. "There, it's not the Adelaide Hotel, but it will keep the rain off." Outside, as if summoned by the mention of rain, the storm intensified with a roar that seemed to come from all directions at once. The wind was no longer gusting, but it settled into a sustained howl that spoke of serious weather settling in for the long haul. Through the small window, they could see the world beyond dissolving into gray sheets of water and flying debris. "How long do storms like this typically last?" Josh asked, moving carefully to peer out the rain-lashed window. "Depends," Amelie replied, joining him at the glass. "Could be hours, could be days. This one feels like it has some staying power." She glanced at his pale profile, noting the way he held his injured arm close to his body. "Which means you'll be here at least until it passes. I hope you're not in any particular hurry to be somewhere else." There was a pause, just a beat too long to be comfortable, before Josh answered, "No," he said finally, his voice carrying something that might have been relief or resignation. "No particular hurry." Something in his tone suggested there was more to that story, but before Amelie could pursue it, a tremendous crash from outside sent them both to the window in alarm. A section of her fence had given way to the wind, the posts snapping like matchsticks and sending wooden rails tumbling across the yard like toys scattered by a giant child. "There goes the eastern paddock fence," she observed with a kind of calm that came from accepting that some things were simply beyond human control. "The sheep will be scattered from here to Kingdom come once this passes." "I could help you round them up," Josh offered, then winced as the movement of speaking jarred his injured shoulder. "Once I'm more use an ornament, that is." Amelie turned to study him with the frank assessment of a woman who had learned to judge both character and capability quickly and accurately. What she saw was a man in his middle 50s, clearly accustomed to physical work despite his current injury, with a kind of steady bearing that spoke of reliability. There was also something else in his eyes, a wariness that suggested he was not entirely accustomed to offers of help being accepted without suspicion. "I might take you up on that," she said finally, "assuming you're planning to stay that long." "As I said, no particular hurry," he repeated, and again there was a note in his voice that suggested deeper currents running beneath the surface of his words. They stood there for a moment, two strangers thrown together by chance and storm, watching the fury of nature reshape the landscape beyond the fragile sanctuary of the house. The wind was carrying with it not just rain now, but red dust from the interior, turning the air thick and dark, and giving the storm an apocalyptic quality that was both beautiful and terrifying. "We should check the kitchen fire," Amelie said finally, practical considerations overriding the strange fascination of watching the storm. "If the chimney gets blocked or the wind shifts wrong, we could have smoke problems." They made their way back to the kitchen, Josh moving more slowly than he probably liked, his hand unconsciously pressing against his bandaged shoulder. The main room of the house felt warm and secure after the spare bedroom, the familiar surroundings offering comfort against the chaos outside. The fire in the stove was burning well, and the chimney seemed to be drawing properly despite the wind, sending the smoke up and out rather than back into the room. "Hungry?" Amelie asked, already moving toward a pantry with the automatic hospitality of a woman raised to feed anyone who found themselves at a table. "I was about to start dinner when you arrived, and getting shot probably works up an appetite." "I don't want to be a burden," Josh said, settling carefully into the chair he had occupied while she tended his wound. "You've already done more than enough for a stranger who had the poor judgment to get himself shot in your yard." "Nonsense," she replied briskly, pulling ingredients from shelves and cupboards with practiced efficiency. "In the first place, you didn't get yourself shot. I shot you, which makes it entirely my responsibility. In the second place, you're hardly the first unexpected guest this kitchen has fed. In the third place," she added, beginning to slice vegetables with swift, sure strokes, "I haven't had anyone to cook for in 3 years, and it will be pleasant to prepare a meal for more than just myself." There was something in that last admission that made Josh look at her more closely. He had noticed, of course, that there were no signs of a current husband or family about the place, but he had assumed that was simply because they were elsewhere, working, visiting, attending to business in town. The idea that this competent, sharp-tongued woman had been living entirely alone in this remote place had not occurred to him. 3 years is a long time to be by yourself, he said carefully, unsure whether such personal observation would be welcome. "Is it?" Her knife never paused in its steady rhythm. "I wouldn't know. I've been too busy to notice." The words were light, almost dismissive, but there was something beneath them that suggested the loneliness had indeed been noticed, had been felt, even if it hadn't been acknowledged. They worked in companionable silence for a while, she preparing what promised to be a substantial stew from vegetables and preserved meat, he watching her move around the familiar space of a kitchen with the fluid efficiency of long practice. It occurred to him that he hadn't sat in a domestic kitchen like this, warm, welcoming, filled with the sounds and smells of cooking, in more years than he cared to count. His recent life had been lived in hotels, boarding houses, and temporary shelters, places where meals were obligations rather than comfort. "What brought you out this way?" Amelie asked as she set the stew to simmer, settling herself across the table from him with a cup of tea. This isn't exactly on the main road to anywhere. Josh's hand moved unconsciously to his coat pocket, where something crinkled softly beneath his fingers. A letter, she thought, though she was too polite to stay. Just traveling, he said, which wasn't exactly an answer. Seeing the country, no particular destination in mind. It was clearly not the whole truth, but Amelie had lived long enough to recognize when a person needed their privacy. Instead of pressing, she nodded and sipped her tea, listening to the storm continuing its assault on the world outside. The rain was coming down in earnest now, drumming against the roof with a steady rhythm that spoke of serious weather settling in for the duration. "Well," she said finally, "you've certainly picked an interesting time to see this particular part of the country. We'll be lucky if the creek doesn't flood before this is over." As if summoned by words, there was a new sound beneath the constant roar of wind and rain, the distant rumble of rushing water. The creek that meandered lazily through a property during normal weather was clearly responding to the sudden influx of water, and by the sound of it, responding dramatically. That would be the creek beginning to run, she observed with the calm of someone who had weathered such storms before. By morning, what was a gentle stream you could step across will likely be a torrent 20 feet wide and deeper than a man's head. "Cutting off the road," Josh said, and there was something in his voice that might have been satisfaction rather than concern. "For days, most likely," she confirmed, studying his face. "Does that trouble you?" "No," he said, and this time there was no hesitation in his answer. "No, it doesn't trouble me at all." There was definitely more to Josh van der Meer's story than he was sharing, but as the storm raged outside and the stew filled the kitchen with its savory aroma and the lamplight pushed back the premature darkness of the weather, Amelie found herself surprisingly comfortable with the mystery. Perhaps it was the isolation of the storm, or the strange intimacy of tending to his wound, or simply the novelty of having another human voice in her house after 3 years of solitude, but she discovered that she wasn't particularly eager to solve the puzzle of her unexpected guest. "The stew should be ready soon," she said, rising to check the pot on the stove. "And there's bread from yesterday that's still good, if you don't mind it being a day old." "Day-old bread sounds like luxury," Josh replied, and there was something in his voice that suggested he had known considerably less comfortable circumstances than a simple kitchen offered. As if to emphasize the comfort of their current situation, the wind chose that moment to howl with renewed fury, sending something, a tree branch, perhaps, or a piece of torn roofing, clattering across the yard with a sound like bones rattling in a cup. The storm was far from finished with them, and by all indications, it was still gathering strength. "I hope your horse found good shelter," Amelie said, ladling stew into bowls with the generous portions of a woman accustomed to feeding people who worked hard and ate heartily. "He's a sensible animal," Josh replied, accepting the bowl with a nod of thanks. "Been through worse weather than this, and in less comfortable circumstances. He'll be fine." They ate in relative quiet, the sounds of their meal punctuated by the constant voice of the storm outside. The stew was excellent, rich and warming, seasoned with herbs from a garden and the kind of careful attention that spoke of a woman who took pride in doing things well even when no one was watching. For Josh, accustomed as he had become to hasty meals taken alone in anonymous places, the simple pleasure of a well-prepared dinner shared at a proper table felt almost overwhelming. "This is very good," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made it clear that the compliment extended beyond mere politeness. "Thank you," Amelie replied, and there was a slight flush of pleasure in her cheeks that suggested it had been some time since anyone had praised her cooking. "It's nice to have someone to cook for again." "Your husband," Josh said carefully, "was ill long?" The question hung in the air between them for a moment, and Amelie's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. When she answered, her voice was steady but quiet. Heart gave out suddenly. One day he was complaining about the sheep getting into the vegetable garden. The next he was gone. The doctor said it would have been quick. "I'm sorry," Josh said, and the words carried the weight of someone who had known loss himself. "It was 3 years ago," she replied, as if that should somehow diminish the impact. One adjusts. But even as she spoke, Josh could see in her eyes that the adjustment had been neither easy nor complete. 3 years of solitude in this remote place. 3 years of conversations with no one but sheep and the occasional traveling salesman. 3 years of meals prepared for one and evenings spent with no company but her own thoughts. It was a kind of exile, whether chosen or imposed, and he recognized something in her manner that spoke to his own experience of living apart from the world. Still, he said gently, "It must be lonely." Amelie set down her spoon and looked at him directly, her grey eyes sharp with intelligence and something that might have been surprise at his perceptiveness. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, it is lonely, though I found that admitting loneliness tends to make people uncomfortable, so one learns to keep such observations to oneself." It was perhaps the most honest thing either of them had said since his arrival, and it hung in the air between them with a weight that seemed to match the storm pressing against the walls of the house. Here were two people, both clearly accustomed to solitude, both carrying their own carefully guarded secrets, forced by circumstance into each other's company and discovering, perhaps to their mutual surprise, that the company was not unwelcome. "People feel loneliness because they think it's contagious," Josh observed, resuming his meal, as if acknowledging that someone else is alone might somehow make them alone too. "Is that the voice of experience?" Amelie asked. "I've spent my share of time in my own company," he admitted, though by choice, mostly. "There's a difference between solitude and loneliness, I think. One is a condition, the other is a state of mind." "And which are you?" The question was direct, but not unkind. Josh considered for a moment, his spoon stirring the stew thoughtfully. "Both, I suppose, depending on the day." He looked up at her, and for a moment his carefully maintained reserve slipped just enough to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. "Today, in present company, I'd say solitary but not lonely." It was Amelie's turn to consider, to weigh the implications of his words and her own response to them. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside the kitchen, with the lamplight warm on their faces and the simple pleasure of shared food between them, the world had narrowed to something more manageable, more human. "Yes," she said finally, "I think I know what you mean." Chapter 2. The Rain, the Red Dust, and the Restless Truth. Morning came grey and violent, with no softening of the storm that had battered the house through the night. If anything, the weather had intensified, transforming the world beyond the windows into a maelstrom of red dust and driving rain that reduced visibility to mere yards. What had begun as a typical outback thunderstorm had evolved into something more fierce and sustained, the kind of weather system that could reshape landscapes and alter the course of creeks and roads for months to come. Amelie woke to the sound of something large striking the side of the house, a tree branch, most likely, torn loose by wind that seemed to have no intention of moderating. She dressed quickly in the practical clothes of a woman accustomed to uncertain weather, and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Josh already awake, standing at the window with a cup of coffee in his uninjured hand. "Sleep well?" she asked, though his appearance suggested otherwise. He looked pale and drawn, and she noticed he was favoring his wounded shoulder more than he had the previous evening. "Well enough," he replied, though the careful way he held himself suggested that pain had been a frequent visitor during the night. "Your shoulder's bothering you more today." It wasn't really a question, and Josh didn't pretend otherwise. "Stiffened up overnight. Nothing I haven't dealt with before." "Let me look at it," she said, already moving toward where she had left her medical supplies. Infection can set in quickly if a wound isn't properly cared for. Josh started to protest, then seemed to think better of it. Perhaps the night had taught him something about the futility of arguing with Amelie Fairweather when she had made up her mind about something. He settled himself at the table and began carefully working his shirt off his shoulders, revealing the bandage she had applied the previous day. The wound looked better than she had feared. No signs of infection, though the surrounding tissue was swollen and clearly painful. As she cleaned and redressed it with gentle efficiency, she found herself again noticing the other scars that marked his body. Old wounds, healed long ago but still visible as pale lines against his weathered skin. "You've been shot before," she observed, her fingers tracing the edge of a particularly prominent scar on his upper arm. "This one looks like it was serious." Josh's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't pull away from her examination. "South Africa," he said quietly. Long time ago. The war? She asked, though she had already guessed as much. The timing would be right, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of military service. The Second Boer War, yes. His voice carried the flat tone of someone discussing events he would prefer to forget. I was with the Australian contingent, young and foolish enough to think war was about glory and righteousness. Amelie finished securing the fresh bandage and stepped back, studying his face rather than his wounds. And now I know better. He pulled his shirt back on with careful movements, wincing as the fabric settled over his injured shoulder. War is about young men dying for old men's mistakes, and the lucky ones who survive spending the rest of their lives trying to forget what they did in the name of duty. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and Amelie recognized the particular pain of someone carrying guilt that had never found absolution. She had seen it before, in other men who had returned from that distant war change in ways that went deeper than physical wounds. "Is that what brought you out here?" she asked gently. "Trying to forget?" Josh was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, the wind howling around the corners of the house like something wild and hungry. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. Among other things, he said finally, "There are some memories that don't fade with time or distance, but a man can hope that eventually he'll find a place remote enough that they can't follow him." "And have you found such a place?" He looked toward the window, where the storm had turned the world into an abstract painting of gray and brown and violence. "I thought perhaps I might," he said. "Before yesterday, I was heading for the coast, planning to book passage to New Zealand, maybe start fresh somewhere no one knew my name or my history." What changed? Though even as she asked, Amelie suspected she knew the answer. Josh's hand moved to his coat pocket again, to that mysterious something that crinkled softly when he touched it. "I received a letter," he said, "in Adelaide 3 weeks ago, from someone I thought was dead." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Amelie poured herself coffee and settled across from him at the table, recognizing the signs of a man wrestling with whether to reveal more himself than he had planned. "Someone from the war?" she asked. "A boy? Really? Barely 18 when he enlisted." Josh's voice grew softer, more distant. "Thomas McKenna, from a farm outside Ballarat. I was his sergeant, responsible for keeping him alive long enough to grow up." He paused, his fingers worrying at something invisible on the table surface. "I failed in that responsibility." "You thought he had died?" "I saw him die." The words came out harsh, almost angry. "Or thought I did. We were separated during a night attack. When morning came, I found him lying in a shell crater, not breathing, covered in blood. The field was chaos, wounded and dead everywhere. No time for proper checks. I left him there." Amelie said nothing, sensing that interruption would shatter whatever fragile trust was allowing him to share this burden. "The letter says he survived," Josh continued. "Says he's been looking for me for 9 years. Says there are things I need to know about that night, about what really happened." He pulled the letter from his pocket then, a folded piece of paper that looked as if it had been read many times. "Says he forgives me for leaving him behind." "But you don't forgive yourself," Amelie observed quietly. "How can I?" The question came out like a challenge. I was responsible for him. For all of them. And when the moment came, when they needed me most, I failed them. Thomas McKenna should have died in that crater, and it's my fault he nearly did. The pain in his voice was raw, unhealed after all these years. Amelie recognized it because she had heard something similar in her own voice during the dark months after Robert's death, when every conversation with herself had been an argument about what she should have seen, should have done, should have been able to prevent. "So you were running from the letter," she said, "from having to face him." "Was I?" Josh looked genuinely surprised at the observation. "I thought I was running toward something. New Zealand, a fresh start, a place where the past couldn't reach me." Same thing, viewed from different directions. Amelie sipped her coffee, studying his face over the rim of her cup. The question is what you'll do now that the running has been interrupted. Before Josh could answer, a tremendous crash from outside shook the house so violently that both their coffee cups rattled against their saucers. They rushed to the window to see that one of the large eucalyptus trees that had provided shade for the house had finally succumbed to the wind. It lay across the yard now, its massive trunk blocking what had been the main path to the barn, its branches scattered like the bones of some prehistoric creature. "Well," Amelie said with a dry humor that seemed to be a default response to disaster, "I suppose that settles the question of whether you'll be leaving today." "The tree?" Josh asked. "The tree, the flooded creek, the washed-out road, and the fact that this storm shows no signs of moderating." She gestured toward the gray fury visible through the window. "Unless you're planning to grow wings, you're not going anywhere for at least another day or two." Josh stared out at the fallen tree, and Amelie could see something like relief flicker across his features. "I suppose I'm not," he said, and there was definitely satisfaction in his voice. "Does that please you?" she asked. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time since his arrival. "You know," he said slowly, "I think it does. It's been a long time since I've had an excuse to stop running that wasn't of my own making." The day passed slowly, marked by the steady rhythm of rain and wind, and the small domestic rituals that make waiting bearable. Amelie moved through her house with practiced efficiency, checking windows for leaks, adjusting the dampers on the stove to maintain steady heat, preparing meals that would sustain them through whatever the weather might bring. Josh, limited by his injured shoulder but clearly uncomfortable with inactivity, helped where he could, stirring pots, setting the table, keeping the fire fed. It was strangely companionable, this enforced domesticity between two people who had been strangers less than 24 hours earlier. They moved around each other in the small space of the kitchen with an ease that seemed to surprise them both, as if they had been sharing the space for years rather than hours. "You're a good patient," Amelie observed as she changed his bandages that afternoon. The wound was healing cleanly, showing no signs of infection despite the humid conditions created by the storm. "I've had practice," Josh replied. "And you're a good nurse. Your husband was fortunate to have your care." Something flickered across Amelie's face. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "Robert never needed nursing," she said quietly. "He was healthy as a horse right up, until the moment his heart stopped. I sometimes wonder if things might have been different if I had been there when it happened. If my nursing skills might have made a difference." It was Josh's turn to recognize the familiar weight of guilt and self-recrimination. "You can't know that," he said gently, "and tormenting yourself with what IFS is a sure path to madness. Believe me, I know." "Do you?" She secured the last piece of tape with perhaps more force than necessary. "And how do you manage it? The wondering, the guilt over things that might have been prevented?" "Poorly, most of the time," he admitted. "I've spent 9 years telling myself that distance and time would eventually make the questions quieter. So far, that strategy has been notably unsuccessful." Amelie laughed, though there was little humor in the sound. "At least you tried distance. I've been trying isolation, and I can report that it's equally ineffective." The questions seem to echo more loudly when there's no other voice to drown them out. They were quiet for a moment. Two people who had discovered an unexpected kinship in their shared experience of loss and regret. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside the small kitchen, something had shifted. The careful politeness of strangers had given way to the more complicated intimacy of two people who recognized something of themselves in each other. "What was he like?" Josh asked. "Your husband." Amelie's face softened in a way that took years off her age. "Robert? He was steady, not exciting, perhaps, but reliable in the way that solid ground is reliable. You knew that no matter what storms came, he would still be there when they passed." She paused, her fingers smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the tablecloth. "He was the one who convinced me to stay here after we married. Said the isolation didn't bother him as long as we faced it together. And after, it felt like betrayal to leave, as if abandoning the place we had built together would be abandoning him as well." She looked up at Josh with eyes that held years of accumulated solitude. Foolish, perhaps, but grief makes its own logic. Not foolish, Josh said firmly. Understandable. We all find our own ways of honoring the dead, even when those ways might not serve the living. Is that what you've been doing? Honoring the dead? Josh considered the question seriously. I thought so. I told myself that carrying their memory, carrying the guilt over their deaths, was a way of keeping them alive. But perhaps it was really just a way of keeping myself dead alongside them. The observation hung in the air between them, stark in its honesty. Outside, as if responding to the weight of the conversation, the wind gusted with renewed fury, sending something metallic clanging across the yard with a sound like broken bells. We are a fine pair, Amelie said finally, with a humor that was only slightly bitter. Two people hiding from life in the middle of nowhere, nursing our respective guilts like precious treasures we are afraid someone might take away. At least we are honest about it, Josh replied. That seems like progress of a sort. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation drifted to safer topics. The challenges of farming in such isolated country, the changes they had both witnessed in Australia over the decades, the small pleasures that made solitary life bearable. But beneath the surface chit-chat, something deeper was developing, a recognition that went beyond mere compatibility. They were both, Amelie realized, people who had learned to be alone without necessarily choosing it. Josh with his guilt-driven wandering, herself with her grief-inspired isolation, both of them carrying wounds that had never properly healed because they had never allowed anyone close enough to help with the healing. The storm's getting worse, Josh observed as the evening approached. The wind had indeed intensified, and the rain was now coming down with such force that it sounded like gravel being thrown against the windows. I've never seen weather quite like this, Amelie admitted. Usually these storms blow through quickly, but this one seems to have settled in for a proper siege. As if to emphasize a point, there was another tremendous crash from outside, followed by the sound of wood splintering. Something else had given way to the wind's assault, though in the limited visibility, it was impossible to tell what. At this rate, there won't be much left standing by morning, Josh said. The house will stand, Amelie replied with confidence. Robert built it to last, and it's weathered worse storms than this. She paused, then added with characteristic dry humor, though I can't say the same for my fencing. I'll be rebuilding half the property once this passes. I could help with that, Josh offered again, assuming I'm still here when the weather clears. Where else would you be? The question came out more direct than she had intended, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks at her presumption. Josh was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. I suppose that depends on whether you'd want me to stay. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest in a way that made them both aware of how much their relationship had shifted since his arrival. What had begun as an accident, a case of mistaken identity and a hasty gunshot, had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. I haven't had company for 3 years, Amelie said carefully. I'd forgotten how much difference it makes, having another person to cook for, to talk with in the evenings. She struggled for the right words. It's been pleasant, more than pleasant. For me as well, Josh said quietly. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere I was welcome, to be with someone who didn't require explanations or apologies for taking up space in the world. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small kitchen, two people who had thought themselves beyond the reach of human connection were discovering that isolation, however long practiced, was not necessarily permanent. Sometimes all it took was the right person, the right circumstances, and the willingness to admit that being alone was not the same thing as being strong. Well, Amelie said finally, rising to check on the evening meal, it seems the weather has made a decision for both of us, at least for now. Yes, Josh agreed, watching her move around the familiar space of a kitchen with growing appreciation for the grace with which he navigated her solitary life. It seems it has. But even as they spoke of the storm making their decisions for them, both understood that the weather was merely providing an excuse for choices they were already beginning to make. The real storm, the one that would determine their future, was not the one raging outside the windows, but the one building quietly in the space between two hearts that had been closed for too long. Chapter 3. The storm breaks, and so do we. The third dawn brought an eerie stillness that was somehow more unsettling than the fury that had preceded it. Amelie woke to silence, a complete absence of the wind that had been their constant companion for 2 days, and for a moment wondered if she had gone deaf. Then she heard the steady drip of water from the eaves and Josh moving carefully about the kitchen, trying not to wake her with the sounds of making coffee. She dressed quickly and joined him, finding him standing at the window with an expression of amazement on his face. The world beyond the glass had been transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Where once there had been red earth and sparse vegetation, now there was a landscape painted in shades of brown and gray, dotted with pools of standing water that reflected the overcast sky like scattered mirrors. "The creek?" she asked, though she could already guess the answer from the sound of rushing water that had replaced the wind's howl. "More like a river now," Josh replied, handing her a cup of coffee. 20 feet wide if it's an inch, and running fast enough to carry off anything that gets too close. They stood together at the window, surveying the damage the storm had wrought. The fallen eucalyptus trees still blocked the main path to the barn, but it was only one casualty among many. Sections of fencing lay scattered across the paddocks like broken matchsticks. The chicken coop had lost its roof entirely, though the birds themselves were visible, huddled together in whatever shelter they had managed to find. Of a small flock of sheep, there was no sign at all. "They'll have found shelter somewhere," Josh said, reading her concern. "Animals have good instincts for weather like this. They'll emerge when they are ready." "I hope you're right," Amelie replied, though a practical mind was already calculating the cost of rebuilding what the storm had destroyed. It would be expensive work for a woman living alone, requiring help she couldn't easily afford and materials that would be difficult to transport to such a remote location. As if sensing her thoughts, Josh said quietly, "The offer to help still stands. I've done my share of fence mending and roof repairs over the years." She turned to look at him, studying his face in the gray morning light. The injury to his shoulder was healing well, though she could see he was still moving carefully to avoid aggravating it. More than that, though, she could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there when he first arrived, a kind of settled quality, as if the storm had washed away more than just the fencing. "What about your letter?" she asked. "What about Thomas McKenna and the things he wants to tell you?" Josh's hand moved instinctively to his coat pocket, then stopped. He's waited 9 years to have that conversation, he said slowly. "I suppose he can wait a while longer." "And New Zealand." A smile touched the corners of his mouth, the first genuinely relaxed expression she had seen from him. "We'll still be there when I'm ready for it, if I'm ever ready for it." Before Amelie could respond to the implications of his words, a sound from outside caught their attention, a rhythmic hammering that seemed to be coming from the direction of the band. They looked at each other in surprise, then moved together to the front door to investigate. Standing in the muddy yard, apparently oblivious to the destruction around him, was a man in a rain-soaked coat wielding a hammer with determined efficiency. He was working on the barn door, which had apparently been damaged in the storm. And as they watched, he completed whatever repair he had been making and stepped back to examine his work with satisfaction. "Hello," Amelie called, stepping out onto the veranda. "Can I help you?" The man turned at her voice, revealing a face that was deeply tanned and creased with laugh lines. He appeared to be in his 40s, with a kind of wiry build that spoke of a lifetime of physical work. More surprisingly, he seemed entirely unfazed by the post-storm devastation surrounding them. "Mrs. Fairweather," he called back, approaching the house with a cheerful stride that suggested he was accustomed to walking through muddy terrain. "Bill Patterson, from the Patterson place about 15 miles south. Thought I'd better check on you after that blow." 15 miles. Josh murmured behind her. He walked 15 miles through this mess to check on a neighbor. "That's the bush way," Amelie replied quietly, then raised her voice to address their visitor. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Patterson. Please, come up onto the veranda. You must be exhausted." Bill Patterson climbed the steps with a grin that suggested exhaustion was not among his current concerns. "Not too bad, actually," Been walking since before dawn, but the country's beautiful after a storm like that. All the colors come out, and the air smells like the world's been washed clean. As he spoke, Amelie became aware that he was right. The air did smell different, cleaner, with a rich scent of wet earth and growing things. For the first time in months, the oppressive dryness that usually characterized the region had given way to something that felt almost fertile. I fixed your band door while I was here, Patterson continued, apparently not noticing Josh's presence or choosing not to comment on it. Storm blew it clean off its hinges, but the hinges themselves were still good. Should hold until you can get proper hardware out from town. Thank you, Amelie said, touched by the casual kindness of the gesture. That's very thoughtful. Can I offer you breakfast? Coffee, at least. Coffee would be welcome, Patterson replied, then finally turned his attention to Josh with frank curiosity. Don't believe we've met. Josh Van der Meer, Josh said, stepping forward to shake the man's hand. I was caught in the storm and Mrs. Fairweather was kind enough to offer shelter. Lucky for you, Patterson said with the easy acceptance of someone accustomed to the necessities of outback hospitality. That was a proper blow. Haven't seen weather like it in years. As they settled around Amelie's kitchen table with coffee and the remnants of breakfast, Patterson regaled them with tales of the storm's impact across the region. Trees down, creeks flooded, roads washed out. It would be weeks before normal travel was restored and months before all the damage was repaid. Your sheep? He added, addressing Amelie. I saw a mob of them sheltering in Murphy's Rock about 3 miles east of here. They looked well enough, but it'll take some doing to get them back home with all the fencing down. Murphy's Rock. Amelie looked surprised. How on earth did they get that foul? Storms make animals do funny things, Patterson replied philosophically. But they're alive and uninjured, which is what matters. I'd offer to help with the roundup, but I've got my own stock to worry about. Lost a good section of roof off my shearing shed. I can help with the sheep, Josh said quietly, and both Amelie and Patterson turned to look at him. I know stock work, and my horse is sound. Might take a few days, but we could get them back. Patterson studied Josh with a frank assessment of a man who knew how to judge both character and competence. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded approvingly. That's good of you, mate. Amelie's got good neighbors, but we are all a bit scattered out here, and everyone's dealing with their own storm damage. It's the least I can do, Josh replied, and Amelie caught something in his tone that suggested the offer meant more to him than simple neighborly assistance. After Patterson left, continuing his rounds to check on other isolated homesteads, Amelie and Josh stood together on the veranda, looking out over the transformed landscape. The silence that had greeted the dawn was gradually giving way to the sounds of recovery, birds calling from the damaged trees, the splash of small animals moving through standing water, the distant lowing of cattle that had weathered the storm in whatever shelter they could find. You don't have to stay, Amelie said quietly. To help with the repairs and the sheep, I mean, Mr. Patterson is right that neighbors help neighbors out here, but you're not obligated to be my neighbor. Josh turned to look at her, and she was struck again by the change in his demeanor since his arrival. The wariness was still there, but it was overlaid now with something that might have been contentment. What if I want to be? He asked. Your neighbor, I mean. The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them had been quite ready to address directly. For 3 days, they had been dancing around the growing connection between them, using the storm and practical necessities as excuses to avoid examining what was really happening. But now, with the weather clearing and the immediate crisis past, the question could no longer be avoided. I don't know how to answer that, Amelie said honestly. 3 years I've been alone here, telling myself I preferred it that way. Now you've been here 3 days, and I'm already dreading the thought of going back to talking only to the sheep. Then don't, Josh said simply. Go back to talking only to the sheep. I mean, it's not that simple, she protested. You have a life somewhere else, responsibilities, people expecting you. The letter can wait, Josh interrupted. And as for responsibilities, I haven't had any real ties anywhere or anyone for more years than I care to count. I've been drifting, Amelie, from place to place and job to job, telling myself I was searching for something when really I was just running from everything. He moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes, the hope that he was trying to keep carefully controlled. What I found here, he continued, in this place, with you, it's the first time in 9 years that I felt like I was somewhere I belonged. The first time I've woken up in the morning and looked forward to the day ahead instead of just enduring it. Amelie felt her heart do something complicated in her chest, a flutter of hope mixed with fear that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Josh," she said softly, "I know it's presumptuous," he continued, the words coming faster now as if he was afraid he might lose his courage if he slowed down. "I know we barely know each other, and I know you built a life here that doesn't include space for someone like me. But if you could see a way clear to letting me stay, to helping you rebuild what the storm tore down, to being your neighbor in the fullest sense of that word, I'd like to try." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of the recovering world around them. Somewhere in the distance, Amelie could hear her sheep calling, and the thought that they were alive and waiting to be brought home seemed like an omen of hope. "There would be conditions," she said finally, and Josh's face lit up with cautious optimism. "Name them." "You write to Thomas McKenna," she said firmly. "You tell him where you are and that when we're ready, you'll meet with him. But not because you're running toward or away from anything. Because it's time to stop letting the past make all your decisions for you." Josh nodded slowly. "That seems fair. What else?" "You let me teach you to shoot properly," she said with a return of her characteristic dry humor. "Because if we are going to be neighbors, I prefer not to accidentally shoot you again." Despite everything, the storm, the destruction around them, the magnitude of what they were contemplating, Josh threw back his head and laughed. It was a sound of pure joy, the kind of laughter that comes from someone who has been carrying sadness for so long that happiness feels like a revelation. "Deal," he said, extending his hand to her with mock formality. "Partners." Amelie took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work, the strength that had carried him through whatever trials had brought him to her door. "Partners," she agreed. As they stood there, hands clasped, the sun chose that moment to break through the overcast sky for the first time in 3 days. Golden light spilled across the damaged landscape, transforming the standing water into mirrors that reflected not destruction but possibility. In that light, even the broken fencing and fallen trees seemed less like disasters and more like opportunities for rebuilding, for making something new from what the storm had torn down. "Well," Amelie said, reluctantly releasing his hand but not stepping away, "I suppose we should start with getting those sheep home." "I suppose we should," Josh agreed, but neither of them moved immediately. They stood instead in the warming sunlight, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, contemplating a future that just days earlier had seemed impossible to imagine. In the distance, carried on the clean air, came the sound of her sheep calling. They were alive. They were waiting, and with patience and work and the help of someone who had chosen to stay, they could be brought home. It seemed like a metaphor for something larger, something that had as much to do with the human heart as it did with livestock. "Josh," Amelie said as they finally prepared to leave the veranda and begin the work of recovery. "Yes." "Thank you for staying, for helping, for—" She paused, struggling to find words of the gift he had given her simply by being willing to share her solitude. "For reminding me that being alone and being lonely aren't the same thing, and that neither one has to be permanent." Josh smiled, and in that smile, she could see the man he had been before the war, and guilt and years of wandering had worn him down to shadows. "Thank you," he replied, "for shooting me. I beg your pardon. If you hadn't shot me," he explained, his eyes twinkling with humor that was entirely new, "I would have gotten my water and moved on, and I would never have discovered that sometimes the best destinations are the ones you never plan to reach." As they walked together toward the barn where his horse waited, stepping carefully around the debris left by the storm, both understood that they were embarking on something that had nothing to do with gathering sheep and everything to do with gathering the scattered pieces of their own lives. The storm had broken more than fences and trees. It had broken the careful walls they had both built around their hearts, leaving them open to possibilities they had thought were lost forever. Behind them, the house stood solid and intact, just as Robert Fairweather had built it to withstand whatever weather the outback might send. Ahead of them stretched the work of rebuilding, of creating something new from what remained after the storm had passed. And between them, in the space where stranger had become neighbor and neighbor was becoming something deeper still, lay the quiet miracle of two people discovering that it was never too late to stop running, never too late to come home. If this journey through storm, silence, and second chances touched your soul, leave a comment below and subscribe to our channel. We share stories that remind us, even in the most remote corners of the world, there's always a heart worth finding.